Good afternoon, everyone. It's Tuesday, February 2nd, 2021. It's Groundhog Day in Gobbler's Knob, Pennsylvania, but here in Idaho, it's cloudy and overcast, and I doubt the groundhog will see his shadow here in Idaho today. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium. Before introducing today's speakers, I wanted to tell you just a little bit about a program happening later this week. Thursday, February 4th is the we call it the Oppenheimer Media Ethics Symposium, sponsored by the School of Journalism and Mass Media. Those of you who are on the Renfrew Colloquium list will receive an announcement about that later today. It's 4 o'clock Pacific time, 5 o'clock Mountain Time on Thursday. And we hope that you can join us by Zoom. It's a very simple Zoom link, uidaho.edu/OP21 for Oppenheimer 21. Today, though, our topic is considering attitudinal uncertainty in climate change skepticism. And our presenters come to us from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at the U of I. Kristin Haltinner is an associate professor of sociology, director of the Certificate in Diversity and Inclusion, and a humanities fellow of the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences. She is a political sociologist who studies, among other things, perceptions of climate change. Dilshani Sarathchandra is an associate professor of sociology and coordinator of the university's Distinguished Scholarships Program. She works primarily in the sociology of science, knowledge, and technology. Today, they will share with us some research that they've done about climate change skepticism from the perspective of those who question or remain uncertain of climate change. So to get the presentation started, please welcome Associate Professor Kristin Haltinner.
Hello, Dilshani is going to be running our technology, so I'll let her, oh, there she goes. But before we get into the heart of this work, I want to tell you how we came about this paper, because it's exactly how science is supposed to work. And I just love that things fell into place the way they did on this work. So Dilshani and I had submitted an article about pro-environmentalism among climate skeptics for review, and it was rejected because one of the reviewers said that uncertainty shouldn't be included in skepticism, that we should only consider those who are outright denying climate change under this umbrella. And Dilshani and I thought about it and talked about it and wholeheartedly disagreed. And so in a matter of just a couple of weeks, we ended up, putting all of these ideas on paper and writing this article. We have a conditional accept on it at Global Environmental Change right now. And I just love it. And that's the perfect journal for this piece, because it's where a lot of the discussion about operationalizing skeptics is. So we're both very excited about it. We hope to hear any day that it's fully accepted. So that's the context. I just briefly am going to touch on a couple of things we mentioned at our last talk, but many of you are the same people, so I don't want to dwell too long on these topics. But the first is an important piece of context. In the United States, we have a higher percentage of people who either are uncertain about or reject climate science. And that's in part because we also have a widespread disinformation campaign regarding climate change. What Dunlap and McWright call the climate change denial movement. I'm sorry that my son is so loud. They're downstairs and I don't have a wall in my office. So if he gets too annoying, I can give him a show to watch. Anyway, so people invested in this movement are right-wing think tanks, politicians, media agencies, and fossil fuel industry agents. And what they do is they do something that's called the tobacco model. And they capitalize on a few scientists who are willing to say climate change isn't happening, and then they magnify their voices to spread doubt about climate change. This has taken root in the last 20 years, more than in the past, for a couple reasons. One is this massive increase in funding from right-wing organizations and fossil fuel industries to spread this disinformation. And you can see the table on our slide indicating the increase in funding from a group called Donors Trust, which is an anonymous right-wing philanthropy group. But also concurrent with the same period has been the broader anti-intellectualism and anti-environmentalism amongst the political right, really starting with and after Reagan, right, the Reagan administration. And it's worth mentioning just briefly that this has also been there's also been a significant shift, perhaps in response to President Obama's administration. John McCain ran on a pro-environmental ticket. He wanted to fight climate change, and he lost. And the Republican Party has largely shifted to this anti-climate, or I guess anti-climate change isn't perhaps the right way to phrase it, but you know what I mean. Not exclusively, there are many right-wing voices that are advocating for climate action, but this has become a very partisan issue. And so that brings us to our next topic. You may not be surprised to learn that skeptics have less trust in science than do members of the broader public. Climate skeptics are also disproportionately politically conservative men. In fact, conservatism is such a strong predictor of climate skepticism that it actually mitigates the effects of education, such that even people who are highly educated, who in general are more likely to accept climate science, amongst conservatives, even that group doesn't. Right? So in addition to those ideologies, certain religious perspectives also are associated with climate skepticism, such as belief in end of days theology. However, religiosity in general has shown to be a weak or inconsistent predictor of climate change beliefs. And Dilshani and I also have written a couple of pieces about that, one of which is currently under review. So I just want to frame our piece a little bit by situating it in the literature that exists. There's been a number of ways that scientists have operationalized the concept of skepticism. And in fact, there's been a pretty robust intellectual debate on this matter. People distinguish between how to frame skepticism or denial amongst climate scientists and then also amongst the public. For this article, we're focused on the public. And so what we saw when we first entered this theoretical fray or empirical fray is that there were some scholars who argued that only active doubters or active deniers, as opposed to those with no opinion, should be considered climate change skeptics. So some people who have been on that side include McWright and Dunlap or Rahmstorf or others. And in this framing, it's really important to think about the active component of skepticism, that they are actively denying climate science. A few studies have expanded this operationalization to include those who have suspended judgment or hold uncertainty. Scholars such as Bliuk et al. 2015 do this by making participants choose if they identify more as a skeptic or a believer. So it's like a continuum for them. Portinga et al. Share our conviction that those who actively reject climate science and those who are uncertain require special engagement. But in a lot of their research, they've had to eliminate the people who don't know about climate change because the sample has been so small. They study the UK public instead of the US public. So this is sort of where our research came in, and we wanted to empirically test. Sorry, we can go to the next slide. We wanted to empirically test what I've added here in red as in comparison to the blue. So this is from the Yale Climate Opinion Maps 2020. The percentage of Americans who believe that global warming is happening at 72%. And we're interested in the other 28%, the 16% of people who don't know, and the 12% of people who say no. And then in the next row, looking at global warming is caused by mostly human activities. We're interested in the 11% of people who are saying they're not sure and the 32% of people who are saying no. So we argue, along with this handful of other scholars, that uncertainty matters. And so drawing on Portinga's work, those authors argue, it's important to distinguish between different attitudinal terms such as skepticism, uncertainty, and ambivalence. And in doing so, they present an extension of skepticism whereby skeptics are those with strong disbeliefs or rejection of the tenets of mainstream climate science. And they consider uncertainty as a lower subjective sense of conviction or validity as to whether climate change really exists, is caused by human activity, or will have major impacts. So our study uses empirical data to assess how uncertainty and denial impact climate change skepticism. So we do this by dividing our sample into 4 groups. Dilshani in a moment is going to talk to you about our methodology, so you'll understand the size of these groups in a moment. But I just want you to understand how we're framing them before we get to that point. So drawing on Capstick and Pigeon's 2014 research, we labeled our first group epistemic deniers. And those are people who do not believe climate change is occurring and do not believe it is impacted by human activity. The second group are epistemic doubters, those who are both unsure if climate change is occurring and also unsure if human activity impacts the climate. The third group that we drew in for comparison are attribution deniers, so people who believe that the climate is changing, but perceive it to be a natural phenomenon not linked to human activity. And then attribution doubters, people who believe that climate change is happening, but are unsure if the phenomenon is human caused. So next, Dilshani is going to talk to you about our methodology and present the quantitative research we did on this. And then I'm going to return at the end to give you some case studies from our qualitative work of what this looks like in action.
Sorry about that. All right, so I will talk a little bit about the methodology as Kristin mentioned. So our data comes from 2 phases of data collection, which includes both a series of in-depth interviews and a survey. So first about the interviews. Between May 2017 and May 2018, we conducted 33 interviews with self-identified climate change skeptics in Idaho. To recruit these skeptics, we used flyers and also posted advertisements in commercial Facebook groups throughout Idaho. And our recruitment ads used explicit language indicating that we were seeking people who are skeptical of climate change. So we ended up with, as I mentioned, 33 participants, 32 of them identified as white, 1 person identified as Latinx. The ages of our participants ranged from 20 to 64. We didn't explicitly ask people for their religious affiliation, but those who mentioned those range from atheist, LDS, evangelical to Catholic. And in terms of political ideology, our participants represented anarchist beliefs, libertarian, Democrat, conservative, and Republican. In order to analyze the data, we used the qualitative data analysis software NVivo and conducted inductive analysis. And subsequently, in November of 2019 to January 2020, we conducted an online survey. So in order to do the survey, we used extant literature on climate skepticism, as well as findings from our qualitative interviews to develop an original survey instrument, which we tested and validated. And we distributed it using the online survey platform called Trix and gathered data from a rather demographically diverse sample of 1,000 people from Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, again, climate change skeptics. And how we gathered this unique sample of climate change skeptics is by using 2 what are called screening questions, right? So in these screening questions, we asked participants whether climate change is happening and whether they thought climate change is caused by human activities, to which they answered yes, no, or not sure. So if a respondent answered yes to both climate change is happening and it is caused by human activities, those respondents were screened out of the sample so that our sample was limited to only people who deny these two situations or had some uncertainty about the realities and human causes of climate change. So our overall sample of 1,000 adults from Idaho, Washington, and Oregon who are skeptical of climate change consisted of about 50% women, 42% conservative, 11% non-white, 35% of our participants were younger than 40, and 20% of them had bachelor's degrees. We conducted our statistical analysis using SPSS.
Dilshani, can I just make a note? So it says in our sample characteristics that 42% are conservative, and I just went over how political partisanship is a big part of this. Yes. A lot of people said that they didn't identify or might have had a variety of unique identifiers, and so we were just emphasizing this particular aspect in this presentation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then we tested a number of different dependent variables across the 4 types of skepticism that Kristin talked about earlier. Right now, we're just presenting 3 of those dependent variables that we tested for: environmental concern, pro-environmental policy support, and conspiracy ideation. So our environmental concern is a 16-item scale that measures average environmental concern of respondents for a series of environmental issues ranging from coral reef bleaching all the way to pollution. Participants express their concern on a 1 to 7 Likert scale. So the higher values indicate more concern. Similarly, for pro-environmental policy support, this was a 13-item scale. Again, higher values indicating more support for pro-environmental policy. Both of these scales draw from and build on previously validated environmentalism scales, such as the New Ecological Paradigm by Riley Dunlop and others. And lastly, our conspiracy ideation measure is a dummy variable for whether or not participants adhere to the belief that climate change is a hoax, where we coded yes as 1 and no and not sure as 0. So among the self-identified climate skeptics in our online survey, about 25% believed that climate change is a hoax. In terms of our independent variables and controls, one of our independent variables is distrust in science. This is a 14-item scale that we developed, validated, and it's already published thanks to the Open Access Publishing Fund from the University of Idaho. We published it in an open access journal. And we also used a number of socio-demographic variables that are theoretically pertinent to climate change, such as political ideology, which Kristin just talked about, gender, race, and age, which are all known to be associated with climate skepticism. And we also controlled for other relevant variables, such as education, income, and religiosity. So let's talk about the 4 different types of skepticism. So we used our screening questions to identify these categories of skepticism, or rather, we think about these as 4 points along what we are going to call a continuum of skepticism, right? So these are points where they're defined along 2 dimensions: the strength of conviction, whether one denies or doubts the existence of climate change and its human causes, and the reason for being skeptical, whether it's a doubt or denial about the physical realities or doubt or denial about its human causes. So in that sense, about 17.9% of our sample belongs to the epistemic denier category. So these are people who said no to both of our screening questions, right? Climate change is not happening. It is not caused by human activities. Epistemic doubters who answered not sure to both categories represent about 23% of our sample. Attribution deniers, these are people who say, yes, climate change is happening, but no, it's not caused by human activities, about 18% of our sample. And lastly, attribution doubters, these are those who say, yes, climate change is happening, but they are not sure whether it's caused by human activities. That is our largest category at 34%. And you will see that there's 2 other possible options here, the no, not sure, and not sure, no categories. In our sample, these were very small, 2% and 5.7%. So we are not investigating those two categories for this particular study. However, these could be potentially relevant groups that we think warrant additional research employing larger representative samples. So how do these groups or points of skepticism compare to each other? So this table right here is a summary of a series of OLS and binary logistic regression models that compare these different types of skepticism across the three main dependent variables that we talked about earlier. So if you look at column 2 here, this is the environmental concern. Specifically, if you look at epistemic deniers, for instance, compared to all other skeptics in the sample, epistemic deniers are the least environmentally concerned, right? You see the higher negative effect here than any other category. However, attribution doubters are the most environmentally concerned compared to all other skeptics, as you see the highest positive regression coefficient here. While there is no statistically significant association between being an attribution denier or not and their environmental concern. And similarly, these trends also hold true for pro-environmental policy support. You see that epistemic doubters and epistemic deniers have lower pro-environmental policy support, and they are somewhat similar, whereas attribution doubters have the highest amounts of pro-environmental policy support, as you see in the different magnitudes and directions of the regression coefficients here. And then lastly, the column number 4 here. These are summary results from our logistic regression models for the belief that climate change is a hoax. So being an epistemic denier, as you can see, significantly increases the likelihood of people agreeing that climate change is a hoax, right? So they have more conspiracy ideation. However, being an epistemic doubter or an attribution doubter decreases the likelihood of believing that climate change is a hoax. So these results again provide evidence for high levels of skepticism among epistemic deniers compared to our other categories. So overall, trends across these models where epistemic deniers seem to indicate the least amount of pro-environmentalism and highest amount of conspiracy ideation. And attribution doubters seem to indicate the highest amounts of pro-environmentalism and least amount of conspiracy ideation. So we suggest that this provides some evidence for the existence of a continuum of beliefs across these 4 different categories. Kristin?
Yeah, so this next chart, this is a chart we made to try to make sense of what we're showing you for those of you who are not quantitative researchers. So if you look at the direction of the arrows, you can see that on almost all of our measures, strength of skepticism, emotional response to climate change, which we didn't include in this article, but is of interest, belief climate change is a hoax, and political conservatism and trust in science, in all of these measures, the denial piece connects together as opposed to the epistemic or attribution piece, if that makes sense, right? So we see how epistemic denial is on one end, followed by, oh wait, I said that backwards. Now I'm confusing myself. So we see how epistemic denial is on one end, followed by attribution denial, then epistemic doubt, and then attribution doubt. But for environmentalism, we see the swap in the middle, right? Wherein the place of the doubt or denial is what's most important. So epistemic denial is on one end, followed by epistemic doubt, followed by attribution denial, and then attribution doubt. So there's an interesting flop that happens in the middle that perhaps says a lot about the importance of whether or not people question humans' involvement in climate change. So to make this a little clear, a little less muddy, I used to have a professor that always said clear as mud at the end of everything she said. So right now, everything's as clear as mud. I want to give you a case study of one of our participants who we think sort of fits in each of these categories. So just to remind you, in our quantitative analysis, we found that epistemic deniers are more likely than other skeptic types to believe climate change is a hoax, to be politically conservative, and to distrust science. They're also less likely to hold environmental concern and less likely to support pro-environmental policies. So let me give you an example. Blake, it's a pseudonym, is an example of an epistemic denier. He identifies as a philosophical anarchist who sees value in certain governance structures, but believes that many powers of the state need to be reeled in. He grew up in rural Washington in a small conservative town, and he does not believe the Earth's climate is changing. And he bases this perspective on evidence of historical periods of global cooling and incomplete data. Blake also does not believe that humans impact the climate. So epistemic deniers such as Blake are much more likely to adhere to the belief that climate change is a hoax. Blake believes that the climate change hoax is perpetuated by the United Nations and that a group of, quote, elites from different nations want to limit human population growth. He doesn't believe that scientists are evil or are necessarily intentionally tricking the public, but he does believe that they're pressured into adhering to the status quo on climate change. Quote, I do not think that they are deceiving others on purpose. Their careers are at stake. If they openly come out against climate change, they are toast. It's a top-down system where they are being told essentially what to do. As we mentioned, epistemic deniers also have lower levels of environmentalism compared to other skeptic types. And it's not to say they don't have any environmental concern. Blake is concerned about pollution. He thinks it's a problem that needs to be managed, as do many of his peers. He's concerned about breathing polluted air, for example. But it's not the same level of concern that we see in our other participants. So for example, he says that water systems are, quote, pretty darn clean, cleaner than they've ever been before. And he argues that people should be concerned about pollution, but not overly so, that there's a threshold when alarm is warranted and we're not at that threshold. He doesn't believe in federal regulations to control pollution, even though it's something he's concerned about. And this mirrors significantly what we see when we look at conservatism amongst epistemic deniers. So even when we control for political conservatism, we still see that being in this category is associated with distrust in science and lower levels of environmentalism. So the next group, epistemic doubters, as we mentioned, they have greater trust in science and lower levels of conspiracy ideation than do epistemic deniers that I just mentioned, but also of attribution deniers. However, along measures of environmentalism, they align between epistemic deniers and attribution deniers. So to make sense of this, I'm going to tell you about James. James is a conservative evangelical pastor. He moved to Idaho as an adult and has an intensive community of family, friends, and congregation members. On the issue of climate change, he says, quote, we don't know climate change is happening. If it is happening, we don't know that men are causing it. Whether they are or not, we don't know if it's bad. In the first moments of his interview, James presented himself as having uncertainty regarding climate change's existence, the role of humans in the climate crisis, and the potential impact of climate change on the planet. But his perspectives are nuanced. He questions climate change's existence because of what he calls historical cooling periods, but he also is concerned about the changing language that scientists use to discuss the crisis, from global warming to climate change to the climate crisis. And he also points to what he believes is a severe hypocrisy amongst climate activists. So he points out that Gore, for example, lives in a large home that has a significant carbon footprint, and he's not wrong. He does. So as a result of these factors, he doesn't trust political leaders and scientists, which leads him to doubt but not reject the possibility of climate change. And people in this group are less likely to believe climate change is a hoax than epistemic deniers, as we mentioned. It is helpful then to think about how James's perspective of conspiracy differs than Blake's. So James believes that the people advancing the narrative about climate change are untrustworthy and seeking to make a profit, but that doesn't convince him to wholly reject the possibility of climate change. In contrast, if you recall, Blake believes that climate change is a manufactured myth intended to manipulate the public. And this therefore breeds greater distrust. Epistemic doubters are also statistically less likely than other skeptics to have environmental concerns and support environmental policy, except for epistemic deniers. When James talks about the environment, he makes a point to distinguish between what he calls environmentalists and responsible stewards. So remember, he's coming at this from a religious perspective as well, and that's religious language stewardship. He views environmentalists as people, quote, crying wolf and protecting environmental crises that never unfold. James believes that people should be environmental stewards and care about problems such as pollution, but he does not believe that governments should be involved in these efforts. He thinks people should seek legal recourse after environmental problems arise rather than regulating to prevent them in the first place. So our third group, attribution deniers. On measures of trust in science, conservatism, and conspiracy ideation, we see them align more closely to epistemic deniers. However, on measures of environmentalism, they align more closely with attribution doubters. So to illustrate this distinction, I'm going to tell you about Douglas. Douglas grew up in a family of teachers, and as an adult became a high school biology teacher himself. He moved to Idaho as an adult, and he's been active in local environmental groups. He's particularly concerned about biodiversity and avian habitats. He recently left the environmental movement because he feels like climate change hogs the environmental debate. And though his opinions have changed over time, he currently identifies as politically conservative, much like other attribution deniers. He believes the climate is changing, but does not believe that humans are causing this change. He says, quote, I think we have clear evidence that we do have a global mean temperature increase over the last 70 to 100 years. But there are so many other non-human players in the system. Regarding the impact of climate change, he doesn't have concerns. He feels that God is in control and will protect the planet. Attribution deniers are not significantly more or less likely than other groups to distrust scientists, but they fall between epistemic deniers and attribution doubters on this measure. So as a high school science teacher himself, Douglas believes that individual scientists are trustworthy, but he distrusts scientific organizations. That's a particularly interesting juxtaposition. So individual scientists are trustworthy, but not science, right? Not scientific organizations. His biggest concern, however, is the way that he perceives science as being used as a weapon in political battles. So he distrusts how politicians present scientific findings to the public in their rhetoric and their attempts to dupe the public. People in this group do not differ significantly from other groups in their level of environmental concern or support for environmental policy, but again, fall somewhere between, as we've mentioned, epistemic doubters and attribution doubters on these measures. So it appears that simply believing that the climate is changing is enough to increase one's level of environmental concern and support for pro-environmental policy. Consider, for example, his contention that even if humans don't impact climate, they should be good stewards of the earth. Quote, I think it's wise and good policy and stewardship to reduce emissions regardless if we are seeing man-made climate change or not. I'm not saying it's a moot point, but I'm saying we should be doing these things anyway. Our final group are the attribution doubters. So amongst the continuum that we've developed, these are the most likely or the least likely to believe climate change is a hoax and to distrust science, the least politically conservative. They're still conservatives, but not as politically conservative, if that makes sense. They hold higher levels of environmental concern and support for pro-environmental policy. I should clarify, they're not exclusively conservatives, but many of them are conservatives, but not as conservative. So to explain this position, let me tell you about Savannah. Savannah is deeply concerned about ocean wildlife. When she was a teenager, she went with her family on a trip to the Oregon coast, and it spurred a lifelong obsession with ocean health, ice cap melting, and associated Arctic ecosystems. She grew up in Idaho and was rather isolated. She's from a very conservative fringe religious group, so she was homeschooled and her social activities were restricted growing up. As an adult, and in concordance with other attribution doubters, she identifies as politically on the line. She struggles with liberal perspectives on abortion and conservative positions on the environment. She believes that the climate is changing, but she thinks that humans can possibly negatively affect the environment. And she's concerned about Arctic health, but she thinks climate change is natural, right? So she says it's very true that there is natural climate change that happens naturally in the world, the way our Earth moves, the way that there's like I want to say a climate season, I guess is the way I would put it. If you go back in our history, you'll see that Earth has almost a clock-like seasonal change where it will go, like you'll have an ice age and then you'll have a warm, you'll have it cool off and then warm up, and you'll have an ice age, and the world will just naturally do this. So that is true. So you could easily argue that she's actually an attribution denier, but then she goes on to talk about how humans might have an impact with, quote, our factories, our cars, and the amount of industrial stuff that we're doing. But she concludes by saying there's actually so much more we could know, and that she isn't sure. However, one thing she is certain about is that the Earth, the planet, will survive any change and heal itself. But she actually has a lot of concern about the impact of climate change and pollution on animal populations that will become extinct as a result of climate change. She does believe that scientists are mostly trustworthy, but she thinks there's probably a few that are not well-intentioned. She doesn't like what she calls the drama being manufactured around climate change and science. As we mentioned, attribution doubters are significantly more likely to have environmental concerns and support environmental policy. And I think, as evidenced by what I've told you so far, Savannah is an environmentalist who is unsure about whether or not humans are causing climate change. So why does this matter? So what we hope you can see is that our work demonstrates the importance of considering uncertainty as part of climate skepticism. If we ignore those who say they're not sure about climate change or unsure about humans' role in climate change, it omits important perspectives such as those of James and Savannah. If we miss out on these important perspectives, there could be potential gaps in our understanding of things like climate communication or common support for climate policy. It's particularly interesting that denial, both epistemic and attribution, is associated with distrust in science, belief that climate change is a hoax, and conservative political ideology. So this suggests that when we fail to include those who are uncertain about climate change in our analysis, we may also inadvertently overrepresent those who distrust science, who believe in conspiracies, and who are politically conservative. Our qualitative data also suggests that uncertainty might be emotionally influenced, let's say. We didn't get into that much in this paper, but we're currently working on another with Jen Ladino, Tom Patak, and Steve Radel, where we're using this framework, but testing other outcome variables. And one of them is emotions about climate change. So participants such as James and Savannah know a lot about climate change. They've read studies, most of which they choose that already align with their values. But it's also possible, based on other research on emotions, that psychological factors may play a role in people's uncertainty. As you're well aware, discussion of climate change evokes strong emotions, particularly what we consider negative emotions, right? Fear, worry, and anxiety. So if one rejects climate change, rejects that it's human caused, or dismisses the potential for negative impacts, then they don't have to feel the associated negative emotions of fear, anxiety, dread, and worry. So it's worth examining more if people who are uncertain might be uncertain because they're afraid, if that makes sense. All right. Dilshani, do you want to cover this, or should I?
Oh, go ahead, Kristin.
Okay, so these are some of our pieces that we've had come out, both on our qualitative work and on our quantitative work. We're having a good year right now. So we just had a qualitative piece come out, or it's about to come out in Rural Sociology. It's the one we actually presented last year here at Renfrew. The survey instrument that Dilshani mentioned, and then a piece about climate change being a hoax last year, as well as a piece about LDS beliefs regarding climate change and how they compare to other religious groups. Last year, we also had a qualitative piece on pro-environmentalism come out. Prior to that, we had a piece on trust and distrust judgments, and then also a piece that was more theoretical about climate skepticism and emotions. We also created this website to share our research team's information, so feel free to visit or share it with others. And I think we're ready for questions. Okay, I see 3 in the chat. I will read them. So we have one, did you ask about their education level to see if there's a correlation there? I'll let you answer. I'll ask, you can answer.
So in the qualitative interviews, I don't think we asked an explicit question about education, but some participants volunteered their background information, including education. For the survey, yes, we did. And the results, the quantitative results that we presented here, all of those, it was just a summary, right? So all of those quantitative findings come from individual multivariate models, and they statistically control for education. So holding education constant, we only presented the associations that were still significant, right? So if we were to assume that everyone had the same level of education, can you still see an association between falling on a particular point in our continuum and its effects on things like pro-environmentalism?
The next question is your sample size, what's your sample size in each category, and is there enough statistical power to have significant conclusions?
Right, so for the survey, we have 1,000 what Qualtrics call good responses. So we incentivize participants to answer all of the questions. So we have a sample of 1,000 observations where respondents were incentivized to answer every question, right? So when we say 34% of our sample was attribution doubters, that means 340 people fell into the attribution doubter category. So we made sure that we had statistical power, sufficient statistical power for our multivariate analysis.
The next one's about interviews, so I can answer it or you, whichever you prefer. I'm a qualitative researcher, and Dilshani is carrying our statistical analysis whole-handedly. Did your interviews include questions about whether people had been directly impacted by wildfire weather extremes and certain health problems? And if so, did that influence their positions on the skepticism scale? That's a great question. So yes, we did talk about these things in our interviews. And in our pro-environmental paper, we actually talk about this as a factor in one's pro-environmentalism. So people who have had negative environmental experiences are more pro-environmental, even if they're skeptical about climate change, if that makes sense. We didn't, because we didn't include that in this piece, but that might be something to include in our next piece about pro-environmental, or about this typology that we're creating, or the consideration of uncertainty. But in short, yes, it matters. Yes, it influences, maybe not their skepticism, but certainly their environmentalism, even if they're skeptics.
We have plenty of time for other questions, and here's one from Lauren, who is asking, you said that some people may be afraid because they are uncertain. Is it possible that they are uncertain because they are afraid? You want
That's actually what I meant to say. So it's possible that I said it the first way, but I meant to say it the second way. So yes.
So fear leads to uncertainty.
I mean, that's the hypothesis. It's something that we need to test further, though we have a piece under review right now with Jen, so Dilshani, Jen, and I, looking at fear, what did we do? Worry and anxiety, fear and worry, dread and worry are the 2 variables that we looked at. And so we find that people who have, tell me if I'm wrong, Jen or Dilshani, but people who say people who believe climate change is a hoax, for example, have less dread and worry than do people who do not believe climate change is a hoax, for example, right? So we see variance in the way that they're emotionally responding to climate change, but we're doing an analysis of that with this typology right now. So we should have an answer with regards to this uncertainty piece in a few weeks.
I have a question from Sky asking about the survey responses that reflect epistemological denial but attribution doubt. Do you have any idea of how those two might be reconciled with each other?
So,
go ahead.
so these are, so epistemic deniers, these are people who denied both the physical realities and human causes of climate change. Attribution doubters are those who say, yes, climate change is happening, but they are not sure about human activities. I'm guessing the question is about how does, is it about shifting the perceptions of epistemic deniers towards attribution doubters, or that making attribution doubters less doubtful about the realities and human causes of climate change? I'm not sure if I follow the question.
I phrased that a little poorly. I was referring to the people who answered a no to does climate change exist, but also a not sure to is it caused by humans? Like if they don't believe
yes.
it exists, how were they
Yeah.
also uncertain of the cause?
That's a really good question, Sky. One of our reviewers raised that question too. Our best guess right now is that small percent, that was 20 people from our 1,000 respondents, they simply didn't understand the screening question. I'm not sure how it's logically feasible for someone to say, no, climate change is not happening, but I'm not sure if it's human caused, right? So we removed those participants from the analysis, the 20 people, because we thought, and someone says maybe they aren't logical, perhaps yes. We don't have any other explanation for that. But we do think that the final category, where someone who said not sure to climate change is happening and no to whether it's human caused, that category certainly deserves further attention. Thank you for that question.
Sarah's question about our research being place-based. So our interviews were all from people in Idaho, not necessarily in this area. And our survey participants were from the Pacific Northwest, so Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And our research team also has two geographers, Tom Patak and Steve Radel. And so Steve right now is working really hard to help us make sense of our data with in association to place. So we can both look at where people took the survey, and then we also ask questions about their attachment to home and their location. Interestingly, so far we have found no association at all with either of those things and any of our other variables, which is interesting because in the geographical literature, place-based identity is highly associated with pro-environmentalism. And so it seems like for climate skeptics, that association is gone, right? So it's actually a really interesting null effect.
Mm-hmm. And something we're grappling with is whether climate change skepticism is some sort of an identity that overrides their geographic location and place attachment and other variables such as those.
I think I asked this question after your last presentation, but maybe I'll frame it a little differently. And you now have much more data than you did a year and a half ago. If you were advising a climate change lobbying group like Citizens Climate Lobby or Bob Inglis's group, Republic M, that is trying to convince people that not only is climate change real and human cause, but that we should be doing something about it. How would you frame messages? What types of themes or emotions could be raised that would help move some of the skeptics over to, if not believers, at least to being neutral on the question of climate change? Are there some images or themes or messages that would be more effective than others?
Yes. So a couple of things. I actually think the first way I would target those messages is targeting emotion. Maybe Jen will want to jump in depending on what I say here, but Jen's our emotions expert. I think what we've seen in a lot of the interview data is that nostalgia is a very strong and concern about future children, future generations is a significant factor even among skeptics. So the perception that their grandkids might not have a planet, or more to a skeptic's view, might not see all the different species of animals that we see today. So they're aware and willing to engage with environmental concern in a way that they might not be willing to engage in climate skepticism or climate change, sorry. But I think nostalgia, and so both looking at the past and thinking about their own memories and their own attachment and their own experiences, but also looking to the future, and they're thinking about what things are going to happen for their kids. But my second answer, I kind of already hinted at, that I would focus on environmentalism and not climate change in those conversations. People, from our research, we found that skeptics are concerned about pollution. They're concerned about air and water quality. They're concerned about habitat loss. They're concerned about animal species loss. They're concerned about renewable energy. And so there's policies that can be agreed upon with people who are skeptical about climate change that would benefit the climate. And you don't need to necessarily agree that the climate is changing in order to agree on those policies. I don't know if Dilshani wants to add anything.
It looks like Sherry and Allie were thinking along the same lines and put questions into chat as I was voicing mine, but maybe we could focus on Allie's question about Idaho. Is there a way to tailor that message to climate deniers in Idaho, but still communicate about the need for sustainable land management practices? Any way to narrow down that broad advice to just appeal to environmental protection?
Yeah, I think people already have concerns about local environmental issues, right? So water and sustainability in our region is a major concern. We had our interview participants talking about, what was that quote, Kristin?
About how Nampa smells like peanut butter and
yes,
something.
Peanut butter and so yes, the air smells like peanut butter, right? So people really gravitates towards local environmental issues, and they want to fix those, right? No one, our participants have explicitly said, no one wants to breathe poisonous air. So discussing those concerns of people who are already here in our area might be one way to bring everyone onto the same playing field so that we can have deeper conversations about these issues, right? I would also add, related to this and what we were talking about before in terms of communication, that we also noticed quite a bit of a sense of marginalization and alienation from the scientific community, both in our interview data and in our quantitative findings, right? So people feel like scientists do not listen to them or do not invite them into conversations about these issues, or that a certain practice of credentialing in science excludes certain voices of the general public, right? So creating platforms such as these where we can have conversations where people feel like their voices are heard at a minimum, if not used in policymaking, I think that's really important as well.
Allie, I would just add one more thought. So yes to everything Dilshani just said, and then also learning the right language. So climate skeptics talk about renewable energy, but they don't call it renewable energy. They call it energy, not sovereignty. That's not the right word, but it's like that. What is the word?
Energy independence.
Thank you. I'm like, energy sovereignty, that's not right. Yes, energy independence, right? So learning the language that the people that you're working with use to talk about the same issues, I think would get you really far.
Would you recommend not addressing that it's human caused? Just get rid of the altogether. Just touch base with where they are and say, what have you experienced, and move from there.
I would. I think it would be ideal if we could get everyone on board, but I think if time is our issue, just working with what we agree on, finding that common ground and moving forward with things that are going to be better for the planet is what we have to do.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really helpful, ladies.
We have a couple of other comments from Bob and Jen in the chat along this theme, and I would call your attention to those. But let's get to Andrea's question. And she's wondering that out of the 49.9% women who did not believe in climate change, how many of those women are also conservative? Was there any attempt to sort of cross the belief in climate change with one's political views?
Yes, we have that data somewhere. I will look for it. I'm so sorry, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but we do have that data. Andrea, if you would shoot us an email, we'd be happy to share some of the breakdowns of interaction effects as well, gender and political ideology.
I don't think it was a significant difference, but I think that there were slightly more women who identified as either Democrats or in the middle, but it wasn't a statistically significant difference between women and men. We had 1 or 2% of our respondents were genderqueer, didn't fit a gender binary, so we can't statistically measure that group.
Thank you, guys.
Kristin and Dilshani, if you wouldn't mind putting your email addresses in the chat, and then anyone with particular questions can follow up. And maybe just one last question from Lauren. What are the implications of your research for educating children about climate change? Anything that we can...
I would love to talk about that. I have a 5-year-old, but Jen actually is probably the best person to talk about this too, Lauren. Jen, I don't know if you're still working on some of your children's outreach stuff, but I have a 5-year-old, and we talk all the time about climate change and about, we call it protecting Mother Earth, and about environmentalism and about human impact. There's so many great kids books out now that didn't exist before. There's so many environmental activity ideas for kids. But my kid gets it. The other day, so he's 5, he turned 5 2 weeks ago, and he got mad at me because one of his presents wasn't used for his birthday. And he said, "Mom, you're hurting Mother Earth when you buy things that aren't used." And so he gets it, and because it's normal for him, he doesn't have a harder time making sacrifices that those of us who were not raised with a sort of a climate mindset do, right? By, say, buying only used things. So anyway, that was my own personal tangent, but Jen is really, she's putting a bunch of resources in the comments as I speak, but this is really her area.
This has been a fascinating conversation, enlivened as usual by the participation of our audience. And that's often where we get the multidisciplinary aspect of the questions and comments that come from people of different backgrounds. And Nancy, thank you for your question. And I hope that maybe Jen or Kristin or Dilshani can follow up with you individually on that. Before we let our speakers go on with their afternoons, I'd like to invite everyone in the audience to unmute or to turn on your cameras and offer a virtual round of applause, or to just put up that hand in the Zoom expression. And I found the slide that I wanted to show earlier about our program on Thursday, which will be of interest to all of you Renfrew attendees, and that's the Oppenheimer Media Ethics Symposium with David Folkenflik of National Public Radio. And again, everybody who is on the Renfrew email newsletter will receive more information this afternoon. But if you're not on that list, just send me an email to kbird@uidaho.edu, and I'll send directions for that. And we hope to see you not only Thursday afternoon, but next Tuesday on February 9th at the usual 12:30 time. So thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and stay warm, stay well, stay dry.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.